Hello, everybody. Just as people begin to filter in through, just a quick word to say thank you so much for joining us for today's Monterey Conversation, which is entitled Europe in the Shadow of World War One. And today we're going to be looking at the subject of the First World War with an eye to its present day salience, and what the origins of World War One could tell us about the nature of conflict in Europe more generally, as well looking at sort of how the First World War became a world war, and how did it sort of radiate out, and of course, how did it end on the battlefield and at the diplomatic tables, especially as we now look at a conflict in Russia's war on Ukraine, where it seems very, very difficult to imagine a way of coming to an end. And also, we'll ask, what can we learn from the elusiveness of order, the recurrence of disorder in Europe that we've seen since 1914 and that we see again today? And to take up these questions, we have two remarkable scholars. Margaret MacMillan is an emeritus professor of history at the University of Toronto and an emeritus professor of international history at Oxford University. She was provost of Trinity College, Toronto, and then warden of St. Anthony's College, Oxford. She's currently a trustee of the Imperial War Museum, and in 2018, she was the BBC Reef Lecturer. Her latest book is War, How Conflict Shaped Us, and she's also written 1919 Paris, which we'll be discussing quite a lot today. And in addition, as we were discussing beforehand, Professor MacMillan wrote one of my favorite books on the uses and abuses of history back in 2008. We're also incredibly lucky to be joined by Patrick Cohrs, who is the Professor of International History at the University of Florence. His work focuses on war and peace and the transformation of the transatlantic and global order in the 20th century. Previously, he was Associate Professor of History and International Relations at Yale University, and subsequently the Alistair Horn Fellow at St. Anthony's College. So there's a nice link there. He is the author of, most recently, The New Atlantic Order, The Transformation of International Politics, 1860 to 1933, which is a truly excellent book in terms of the scope and the detail, but also the writing, and I would recommend everyone. Thank you both so much, Margaret and Patrick, for joining us. As you can hear, my voice is going a little bit, so I'm going to hand over very shortly. But just as a quick note of housekeeping, we're going to discuss some of our questions, but we'll also have time at the end for audience questions that you can type into the question box. So please do feel free to contribute, because we always like to have some audience questions. Okay. Now, before the voice goes, I would like to just get really stuck in with it. And Patrick, what makes a war a world war?
That's a very big question to begin with. And maybe we should center on the question, what made the Great War a world war? And clearly, I think there are many aspects to this question, but it was very clear from the beginning that even though this war started or was ignited in the Balkans over a crisis involving obviously the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the stakes seemed massive and soon global from the very beginning, because not least we had, as some of the main belligerents, multinational globe-spanning empires. Of course, most prominently the British Empire, the French Empire, but also the German Empire as it was then, and the Russian, and to a lesser extent the Austro-Hungarian Empire would be involved, and would also involve their extra-European territories, populations in this war. Further then, very soon, this war escalated beyond the capacity to think of almost all of those who had started it with a view to winning it quickly, decisively. And this also meant that the impact of this war became sort of reached far beyond Europe in terms on the world economy, but also on world politics. And a particularly interesting, I think, example is that this was a war in which some states and polities tried to stay out and stay neutral, but most momentously, the United States, which for some time under Woodrow Wilson tried to suggest that it could stay out as a neutral arbiter and then sort of orchestrate a new kind of peace, could not do this after some time. And so other states, other powers were drawn into this conflict, which again escalated. And finally, if we look at different regions of the world, none really, apart maybe from the Antarctic region, remained unaffected by this war. Africa, because there were kind of, theaters of war across the continent, and East Asia, because the Japanese government, especially the Japanese military leadership at the time, was trying to seize on the chaos, the changing and structures in Europe to widen its sphere of influence in China and to think differently about how it would position itself in the post-war order. So East Asia too and China were drawn into this conflict. So we see that under modern terms, which I call the long 20th century, it was almost impossible to stay out of this war, and then not to be affected by it.
Thank you. So there's this sense of, I suppose, of contagion, whether perhaps contagion mixed with a bit of opportunism. Would that be a fair summary?
Certainly, but also in many ways, the war sort of challenged and changed all kinds of assumptions of what it meant to win this war, to run a successful campaign, the kind of mobilization that would be required in societies that were not yet fully democratic, but democratizing, and where you had to make sure that not just those who fought on the front lines, but also entire populations, and of course the female populations of all these belligerents would stay the course in this war. It also changed in so many ways ideas that had been, or let's say brought to the fore, all kinds of ideas about how to prevent a recurrence. First of all, how to end this war, and then how to prevent a recurrence and build a better, more war-resisting international order. And this too became a global kind of struggle of who had the most eloquent concepts, who would set the terms of the peace. I'm sure we will talk about this later on.
Yes, we will. Thank you, Patrick. There's quite a few points there that we will either come to or that I'd like to come to around sort of mobilization and of course about peace and how to create it and how to make it enduring. Margaret, if I could turn to you perhaps with the next question. Is it fair to say that world wars always start in Central and Eastern Europe? And if it is, then what does that say about perhaps what we might imperfectly call larger states' relationships towards that region that creates these combustible conditions?
I'm not sure it's fair to Eastern Europe to say that wars always start there or that wars always start in the Balkans. But we do have parts of the world which are tempting for outside powers because they have internal divisions and because they have something that might be important. And so, for example, in the case of the Middle East, it was a crossroads for much of the world, a crossroads for trade. And then, of course, in the 20th century, when oil was discovered, it became a very important part of the world as we became increasingly dependent on the fuels produced in the Middle East. And the Balkans, again, are at a crossroads. I mean, they exist at the end of they're at the end of the Mediterranean. They represent a link between Asia and Europe. And they have often been deeply divided by internal conflicts. Not always. I mean, I dislike very much the idea that the Balkans are always like that, always fighting each other. And the same thing with the Middle East. This is a reductionist argument. But there are divisions, and those divisions, I think, were exacerbated sometimes by modernity, by change, but also exacerbated by outside meddlers. And so you have this toxic or very dangerous combination of local rivalries, which can be fostered, played out, used by outside powers, which makes it that much more dangerous. And I think what you also have, and it happens time and again in great power relationships, is you have great powers sponsoring lesser powers. And we tend to think of the patron-client relationship as the patron always telling the client what to do. But often the prestige of the patron is tied up with protecting the client. And so quite often, without it fully meaning to, great powers will get drawn into conflicts by their smaller allies. And I think that's really true of the case of Russia. For various reasons, a lot of the Russian elite before 1914 wanted to support Serbia. Some of it was sentimental. It was pan-Slavism. Here was our little Orthodox brother. But it was also, I think, a way of showing their rivalry with Austria-Hungary. It was also a way of perhaps moving in towards the Ottoman Empire, which they had designs upon. And so Russia, without, I think, fully realizing it, got drawn into Serbia's conflicts. And so you have, I think, a number of factors coming together to make, at certain times, it's different parts of the world and different times, but certain times, particular parts of the world, very combustible. And I think we're seeing the same thing today in the Middle East. We're seeing the same thing in the South China Seas. And it's when you get, I think, this combination of local conflict with this great power conflict that it becomes very dangerous indeed. And they're gamblers. You know, they all are playing a very dangerous game. I think a lot of those who took Europe into the First World War didn't think it was going to happen. They thought it would be a game of bluff. They'd force, as they had done before. I mean, there'd been several crises in Europe before 1914 where people had said, oh, we're going to have a war, and then they'd back down. And each side had used sort of tactics like mobilizing very ostentatiously, or moving troops up to the frontier, or ordering more cavalry mounts, or ordering more weapons. And this had been a sort of game of bluff. And the terrible thing, or the terrifying thing about bluff and deterrence, is it can go wrong. And you reach a point where you can't stop. And I think that was also a factor in 1914, that you had a sort of tendency to gamble, a tendency to push the relationship with your opposing power. And they reached a point where they went over the edge.
That is quite terrifying within current conditions. Just a way of thinking about it, and of some of the really obvious similarities, such as moving troops to the border and then moving them back, which are some of the reasons perhaps why people didn't expect the Russian invasion, and then of course bluff, and when bluff goes wrong. But rather than focus too much on that awful possibility, I'd like to come back a little bit more to the World War I and the idea of sort of course it's pretty futile and complicated to try to pin down, sort of who started World War I, who is to blame. Because the backdrop is very complex, and as you explain in Paris 1919, it requires an understanding of a different mindset. For example, sort of the prevalence of social Darwinism and certain cognitive features of mankind that are still relevant today, such as sort of sunken costs. We've gone this far, now we have to do it, to avenge these. And why are these elements traditionally relegated in discussions of World War I and actually of war in general in preference of explanations that rely on security or high politics, or, sort of the history of one man, as if that the history of the Kaiser explains why World War I happened?
Well, I think we don't want to think that war is inevitable, and we don't want to think there's social forces which are pushing, or intellectual forces which are pushing towards the outbreak of the war. The problem with trying to work out how the First World War started is I think we never can do it. There were so many overlapping and interconnected features, and you can go, everything from particular national interests and national policies to the mental framework within which so many have existed. I mean, you can look at specific nations, and they have their own interests and their own ways of doing things, but they existed in a world in which ideas cross borders and attitudes cross borders and values cross borders. I mean, as Patrick has said, it was an enormously interconnected world, and that was particularly true in Europe, although the rest of the world was being drawn into these connections. And so you have this combination, and how much weight you give to each one is what we will be arguing about as long as they're historians. I mean, there is no agreement on how the First World War started, and I don't think there ever will be. It's just one of those things that is at so many different levels, and how you weigh those factors. But I think what is important is you have a France that is determined on revenge, or at least, when we say France, I mean the government, those making policy, because nations themselves are made up of lots of different countervailing forces and different groups with different views. But there was a view in France that France needed revenge on Germany. It's mixed up with fear. Germany was expanding more quickly. The German population was growing more quickly. And so there was a French concern. There was a fear in Russia. Fear plays a part. And the Russians were looking at Germany. They were looking at Austria-Hungary. They were afraid of defeat. They were afraid of attack. The Germans increasingly were afraid of Russia. In 1914, a great many of the German high command argued, as they were trying to decide whether or not to go to war, that if we don't fight Russia now, we won't be able to fight it by 1917. And so that puts its own sort of pressure on. And then you can add in other things like I mean, you mentioned social Darwinism. I mean, the idea that the worth of a nation is, and the worth of those days, people talked about races as freely as they talked about nations. The worth of a nation or a race is in its ability to fight, its struggle to survive. I mean, this is a misapplication of Darwin's theories, but it was very powerful, particularly again among certain groups. And you need to look at who was making the decisions. And a lot of them had this rather fatalistic attitude that life is an eternal struggle, and those nations that aren't prepared to struggle are going to disappear. And there's a moral side to it. They should disappear. They are not fighting to survive, and then they therefore deserve to disappear. You have that. You have a heightened militarism in a number of countries, that the military virtues are ones we want. This is what we need in society. The young should be prepared to sacrifice. There's a lot of concern on the other side that the young were getting decadent, that they were lazy. There was a lot of fear that cities weren't good for you. You know, all those sturdy farmers had moved into cities and they'd become decadent, and they were more concerned about enjoying themselves and weren't prepared to sacrifice. So there are all these sort of fears, attitudes, hopes, and somewhere in all this mix is, I think, a very common, and it goes again right across border, among the military and those who support them, a belief that they can fight and win wars. Pretty much, I think, all the major powers had abandoned their defensive plans by 1914. They were all offensive plans, and they were predicated on the idea that there would be something called a decisive battle, which was, in my view, a misreading of history. They looked only at those decisive battles which fitted their pattern. And what they missed is quite often the decisive battles didn't end the war. Napoleon lost in the end. He won many decisive battles, but in the end he lost them. And that was because he ran out of manpower, he ran out of materials, he had too big a coalition against him. But I think there was this very dangerous belief among the military and I think among a number of the politicians and parts of the public that war was winnable, that we can go in. The campaigns were planned to be short. They hadn't stockpiled equipment. The German army thought they had enough ammunition for the whole war, and they ran out of shells in the first 6 weeks of the war. But this was, I think, helps to explain why they went to war in what we look back and say was a very casual way. And so, as I say, I'm not going to say how it started, because I just don't think you can. And it could have started in different ways in different times. It might have started in a very different way in 1912. It might have started in a very different way later on. There was this real fear in Britain, for example, that the relationship with Russia was going sour, and that they would not be able to renew their agreement in 1915. There was always talk in both Germany and Britain of how they should work together. Germany had the biggest land army in the world, most efficient at least, and the British had the biggest navy in the world. And so those in both Berlin and London who said, we are natural allies. And so it is quite possible by 1915, the international order in Europe would have changed, but you might still have got a war because, as I say, there were these other forces that tended to push towards it.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's fascinating. Part of me is quite tempted to go down the sort of counterfactual history and try to sort of work out what alliances might have been where, what would have happened, would the two revolutions have happened. But I feel like that way probably madness lies. So instead, let's not so much move away from the origins, but Patrick, perhaps I could ask you, what do the origins of World War I tell us, if they tell us anything, about the nature of conflict in Europe in that sort of that longer 20th century?
Well, I think Margaret has already outlined much of with what I agree about the different layers of these conflicts. And but if I tried in my last book to add another interpretation to the origins debate, and one of the things that I would especially focus on is so we have these structural problems. Mark mentioned the region of southeastern Europe at the time. There are all kinds of fears and problems and major crises that those who were leading the different powers and were looking at these conflicts had to deal with for decades. And I've been very interested in the idea of showing how they, rather than drawing some deeper lessons because of the mentalities of the time, I call it more civilizational Darwinism, this competitive streak, this idea that you can only do so much to deal with fears. You have to make alliances, you have to know who your enemies are, who your friends are. had one sort of consequence that I find particularly interesting. So in 1914, when Sir Edward Grey tried to make a last-ditch attempt to bring the powers together and to call them to London to negotiate some de-escalation, he was invoking something that's called the Concert of Europe. Yeah, and those who he addressed still knew what these words meant, but the actual concert, that the whole idea behind that you have a common kind of collective great power system that would deal with conflicts like the one in Bosnia, had been eroded, had been corroded, and a lot of the decision makers in very different ways. Yeah, there's a big difference between British politicians at the time having the fate of a global system, global empire at heart, and Germans who were giving, for example, Austria a blank check in the Balkans and were ever more afraid that, or ever more thinking they needed a preventive war, yeah, to prevail against Russia. Nonetheless, I would say what all of these elites had in common, they had got so used to this prevailing kind of real political kind of quick fixing, yeah, that you fix crises, but you don't change anything fundamental. And rebuilding something like a new international concert, as would be attempted through the League of Nations after, yeah, and during and after the First World War, this was for them quite alien. Yet at the time, there were many warning voices from the left, from liberals, from others. Yeah, if we think of the Hague Conventions, all the international lawyers, the Second International, yeah, pacifists, of course, with sometimes very far-reaching ideas of what could be done, but nonetheless, it was not as though nobody had seen what kind of potential for escalating conflict and world war existed in the world before 1914. And I think this is one of the kinds of parallels that I would just point to if we think back to the time before February of this year and what people used to say about what you could do with Putin, how to understand Russia, all the kinds of ideological sort of statements that were made that are now being put to a reality check test. And what this happened in a much more drastic way still in the course of the second half of 1914, when all of the kinds of illusions of either winning a war or preventing it went up in flames.
That's a very interesting comparison. Thank you. Thank you for such a detailed answer. Margaret, Patrick, I want to come back to some of the comments you made about certainly some of the concepts, sort of international law and rules-based international order. But first, I would just like to ask Margaret, perhaps it's going to sound like a really stupid question, but World War I is often referred to as the first modern war, and I think often people think about this in terms primarily of the sort of the military techniques used. But in what other ways was it the first modern war, or was it the first modern war? Is it an even more stupid question than I understand?
No, it's not a stupid question at all, because it is, war was changing. And the First World War, in many ways, I think, was a culmination of those changes on a much greater scale than people had ever imagined possible. But what was happening, I mean, I think historians would date the emergence of modern war probably back to the 18th century. It begins to emerge then. But what really is happening in the 19th century is a combination of the growth of nationalism and much greater public participation in the life of the country, with the spread of literacy, the spread of modern communications, education. A lot of people are moving into cities. You know, Europe is becoming urbanized. It was a very rural continent in 1800. It's a very urbanized continent, certainly the western part by 1900. And far more people are engaged in the life of the nation, which is something governments are uneasy about. They feel they can use this, but they also worry about it, and it does put pressure on them. And you get a growth of sort of the idea that we are somehow better than our neighbors. And there is this thing called the nation, which is eternal. I mean, it has often religious aspects to it. The nation precedes the individual, it will outlive the individual, it is eternal. And it is a very powerful motivating force, I think. And what comes along with it, and this is where it's linked to social Darwinism, is this idea of natural enemies. And you get French professors, French military attachés, German professors, German military attachés, talking about the other as our natural enemies, our eternal enemies. They've always been our enemies, they always will be. There's no way you can't deal with them. And so I think there is that fear. And I think Patrick is right. I mean, you have the sort of cerebral grey view that it can all be done by the Council of Europe, which is really defunct by this point. I mean, it sort of kept peace in the Balkans in those two Balkan wars of 1912 and 1913. But you don't get enough thinking. And again, I agree with Patrick about what can replace it and how catastrophe can be avoided. And I think there are two things possibly here, probably others, Patrick can correct me, but it seems to me that one of them is a sort of complacency, that we've had this series of crises. You know, there's a crisis when Austria-Hungary annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina. There was a crisis when Libya attacked the Ottoman Empire. There was then a crisis in 1912 and 1913 in the Balkans, but Europe got through it. And where that was dangerous was, I think, a feeling that we can manage this, you know, that it's not really going to happen. I think a lot of people, some people wanted war, but a lot of people thought it was improbable. But the other thing I think that's happening, to go back to your question about is this the first modern war? I mean, I think there is a different attitude towards war. There's much more public engagement in it in a way that I think Europe hadn't seen, except possibly in the religious wars of the 17th century. But what's also happening is just the sheer capacity of Europe to destroy itself, the sheer capacity to sustain wars. And that's part of modern war. The use of the whole nation, the mobilization of the whole nation, the mobilization of the factories, the mines, the farms, but also the mobilization of brains, the mobilization of science, the mobilization of writers, the mobilization of thinkers. And all of this is part of modern war. And Europe and the world were beginning to see that before 1914. And the American Civil War was a foretaste of what was coming. You know, massive power of industrialization, productions of enormous amounts of arms, and ability to mobilize large numbers of people using railways and using the factories. The North had the advantage there. But also the wars that were fought between, say, Turkey and Russia. Again, you began to see something. And the war between Russia and Japan between 1904 and 1905 showed the size and the scale of modern war. And there were people warning about this. And there were people like Norman Angell. Well, Norman Angell, that was a British writer, who said we can't have a war because our economies, or we were unlikely to have one because our economies are so closely intertwined. But there were people like Yvan Bloch or H.G. Wells, and Jean Jaurès, the great French socialist, who said the future war can be a stalemate. Neither side will win. It will be hideously destructive to Europe. And they were tended to be dismissed because they were civilians. What do they know about war? And so the military just kept formulating their plans, and they said, with a bit more manpower, with a bit more optimism, with a bit more of the right sort of spirit, we can overcome all the tremendous advantages that technology is going to give to the defense. And so I think it's a very good example of how we can ignore evidence that is right under our noses, and we don't want to hear the things that shake our views because, we've invested a lot of time and energy. The military had invested a lot of time and energy training and planning for wars in certain ways, and they didn't want to think that it wasn't going to work. They'd also had a lot of money from their governments. And so the idea that they could turn around to their governments and say, look, actually, we're very sorry, we promised you victory, we don't think we can do it, was unthinkable. And so I think you have to, when you look at 1914, you have to think of what's come before. And so to go back, I'm sorry, it's a long-winded answer to your question. It's not, I think, the first modern war, but it's the culmination of modern war on a scale that few people had expected, but some people had expected it.
Thank you for that answer. Patrick, I'll just hand over to you in case there was anything you wanted to come back on there because Margaret specifically asked.
Yeah, I very much also see it as a culmination, and of course it's part of, unfortunately, a wider process, which I don't like the idea of the 30 years war of the 20th century. It has too much of inevitability and one thing leading to another. But of course we have to see the trajectory that goes from the 18th century to the Second World War and beyond towards nuclear war. So there's always the between sort of forces of modernization leading towards stalemate and defensive mass slaughter that later on, again mobilize warfare. If you think of the 1940s, or take us to the realm of the nuclear bomb. So, but again, one of the most modern features that I see in the course of the First World War is something Margaret has already alluded to very, very convincingly, and that is the involvement of societies and and the effort governments have to make also to motivate, mobilize, and to find and a cause to fight for. I think one of the big problems in the First World War, after the first illusions have been shattered, is what on earth is this war fought over? Yeah, so this leads to an immense militarization and magnification of war aims. Yeah, so to fight for democracy and liberty, or to preserve German culture. And it's particularly interesting. Margaret mentioned that British and German actors before the war had a tremendous rivalry, but there were also many attempts to come to terms and to see, aren't they the most advanced with the United States Protestant powers that should rule the world? And after 1914, this changes into this vile war of philosophers, it's been called, and war of writers and historians who are accusing the other side of being the most heinous adversary, precisely because they didn't think it was such a natural and inevitable thing. And so this is, again, one of the features of the modern war that also globalizes. I mean, we have someone like Woodrow Wilson entering this, and Lenin, of course, in the wake of the Bolshevik Revolution, investing this war with their different meanings. So a war that should start a Bolshevik revolution and a complete change of the world order, as Lenin or Trotsky and others would have it. And for Wilson, a war that showed the futility of European realpolitik and the old ways, and was now supposed to usher in an American century. But this is a president who had hardly any major experience, international understanding, and was sort of making up grand vistas of a future world order, which nonetheless had tremendous power, also as a warring device. So, for example, the idea that he only really prepared in reaction to Lenin, that now we should go towards an era of self-determined states and freedom for peoples and democracy in combination with US-style capitalist rules, and that this would somehow allow us to build a new order that would keep the world safe from war. These are, interesting ideological premises, but the kind of impact they had and the expectations they created, I think they take us to the heart of this modern kind of problem of war that then becomes a massive problem of peacemaking, namely to fulfill these immense expectations. Again, I'm trying to suggest bridges from war to peace here. Not so good, I'm afraid.
No, it was very good. I find it very interesting. It's hard for me as a Russianist not to think about it in the context of Russian partial mobilization, and also sort of some of the problems that they face in terms of in a country where you encourage sort of political apathy, in a country that's clearly not a participatory democracy. How do you actually mobilize? And of course, there's some of the languages, some of ideas, then they have also make it very difficult if, as the Kremlin argues, they're fighting these sort of heinous Nazis. Well, how on earth do you come to peace with heinous Nazis? It's very difficult to make the case for it in any case. But thank you. That's a really interesting answer. I see we've already got one question in the Q&A. If anyone else would like to put a question there, please do, particularly if they're related to sort of mobilization. I think there's definitely more for us to mine there. But before we do, I would like to talk. I'd like to ask you, Patrick, to kind of squidge together two of the questions that I had. So one of them is on some of the concepts that we currently use to make sense, I suppose, of our geopolitical surroundings, and the role of World War I in shaping those, particularly the end of World War I, and sort of linked to that, why you think it wasn't possible to forge a durable Atlantic peace after the end of World War I, as you discuss in your book.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that should only take me a few seconds to answer.
Sorry.
That's always like that. But let me try a stab. So first of all, I think, much in the way, as Margaret has explained, that World War I was a culmination rather than the first modern war. I think in terms of what it did for conceptions of modern global order, premises and principles, norms in the international sphere. I would say it was more a catalyst than a generator. So a lot of these ideas from the League of Nations, self-determination, democratization, let's say, some kind of better form of international security, be it collective security, security through strengthening of international law, arbitration, they had all been around, sometimes for much of European and world history. But the interesting point is, when can they actually gain a force that they could actually become the new prevalent actual norms in something like a conception of world order? And this is where the Great War, I think, because it smashed the old, what I would call the disorder of these shifting and countervailing alliances and ideas that you had to go for imperial defense and balance of power politics. At least it challenged them. It did not replace them by any means. There were still a lot of actors who adhered to these kinds of conceptions, not least in Russia. But nonetheless, it created a situation where the idea that this had been such a massive catastrophe that something more fundamental should change could gain new traction. And I mentioned Woodrow Wilson, but also if you think of Lloyd George, Clemenceau, and the French in a much more inventive and interesting way than they are usually portrayed as having done. And also the Germans, both before they lost and then once they had lost, all the more fervently wanted to be part, and as many others, I'm just mentioning them as examples, of a project that would now replace this greatest war with the greatest ever peace. And here we already come to one of the great challenges. I'm trying to show in this book, The New Atlantic Order, that much as I think Margaret has analyzed very brilliantly, so in 1919, there was such a superabundance of multi-layered challenges and problems and running targets in Eastern Europe. What would happen with Russia, how to deal with Germany and so on, how to revamp the world economy, how to build a League of Nations, that it was almost too high an expectation on any victors or those who were democratically, more or less democratically elected statesmen, to try to forge order out of these, out of this kind of situation. But it was made even harder by the fact that in an unprecedented way, there was not one power, but a coalition, that had to come to terms with each other in order to originally present the vanquished and others with the terms that they wanted to agree upon. This became very hard. And further, they had to legitimize this to their domestic audiences, which sacrificed so much, and who wanted some kind of compensation, reparation, and others. And so we have these conceptions such as the League of Nations, let's say an international institution that should have something like a Security Council, a new almost parliament of mankind and womankind, as the suffragettes would insist at the time, should now replace the old ways, the old kind of thinking. Similarly, so self-determination or some version thereof was supposed to reshape Europe, but also should be applied to the Middle East, as some argued, and to East Asia, as the Chinese and the Koreans and many others wanted. Yet this was such a complex situation that a lot of those who had relatively the most power to shape this peace settlement, they still, in their ways, thought in very hierarchical terms of who was supposed to run the League of Nations, who was allowed to be allowed in, who was actually allowed to determine their own affairs. And this was a major struggle. So I think we can say, and that would be my argument in this book, it's really the first modern reordering and peacemaking process on this vast scale. And given that the scale was so vast, I would say a lot was accomplished, but certain very core requirements that would have made this peace order more durable, or that were required, were to make it legitimate, for example, not just for the victors, but also for the vanquished, not just for those who, like the Poles and the Czechs and Slovaks, had a state out of this war, but also for the others, for example, the Ukrainians and many others outside Europe, who were clamoring also to have a stab now at self-determination and who were left aside. Yeah, so I try to show, and I think that's worth thinking about, that in the 20th century, we have to get away from this idea that we reorder and make peace at one big conference after a massive war. We have to look at a much wider peacemaking and reordering process. We can look at Versailles in the 1920s and the Locarno and other agreements that really changed Europe and had global implications. We can look, if we take the post-World War II scenario, Potsdam, but then, of course, under the influence of the Cold War, the big decisions of the Marshall Plan era and NATO into the 1950s. And of course, we then have to cast a light on 1989, 1991, and what really happened after this Cold War. If we think of what could one do with Russia? And one of the key sort of challenges I want to stop at here, it would be, how do you integrate into your recast international order those who lost the war or were rather coming out of it humiliated or with a self-perception of humiliation? So this used to be particularly a German problem 100 years ago, but not only. Think of Hungarians, many others. But it's very much a Russian, a Russian question of our time. This question already existed 100 years ago, but it was overshadowed by the Bolshevik problem, because Russia suffered a humiliating defeat in the First World War. And so here, I think this is here we can draw some lessons, but also look at this with humility. If we go back to what those who were trying to reorder the world actually accomplished and tried to do 100 years ago.
Thank you. That's fascinating. One of the things I enjoyed actually a lot in your book was around the discussions of Versailles and the nations that were left out, and of course the relevance of it being sort of the Ukrainians who weren't really able to get a look in, but also just this idea that sort of, right, we've got one conference once and for all, let's just sort it out and we can all just get on, and how that might be too simple.
Nice. It would be nice.
Yeah, exactly. We've got until Thursday, it will be fine. Yes. Margaret, to come back on some of these points, do you feel that, or do you think that we, and if we say we here as sort of politically informed, maybe sort of popular imagination, I'm not sure if that makes it more or less vague, learned the wrong lessons from the Treaty of Versailles and from the sort of the peacemaking processes, because it's been invoked as an example quite a lot recently of why we shouldn't, to use this term Patrick just referred to, humiliate Russia or Putin, and also in other ways. But is it useful as an analogy, or is it,
It depends how you interpret the analogy. I mean, I think there's been, I would say, a caricature view of the Treaty of Versailles and the Paris Peace Conference as a whole, because the Treaty of Versailles was only one of 5 treaties that came out of that conference, that it led directly to 1939. And my short answer to that has always been, and I think always will be, look, this is a 20-year period. What was everyone doing for 20 years? And this view that, but I think Patrick put it very well, this view that peace is something that's suddenly achieved. You have a conference, we got peace, that's that, we're back. And a sense, I think, somewhere in there that peace is the normal state of affairs. And so we're just returning order, we've got peace again, everything's okay. Peace, as we're seeing today, and we should always remember, has to be built the whole time. It's a process. It doesn't just exist because we want peace and because we have organizations which talk about maintaining peace. We have to keep working on it. And in fact, I think in Europe, and I think historians are now, including Patrick, are now looking at this period much more of the 1920s. I mean, the 20s have tended to be seen as just a prelude to the 1930s when everything went downhill towards the Second World War. And there was real work done in the 1920s, and I think there was real hope. I mean, yes, we can look at the mistakes, but things were done in the 1920s, which, like Locarno, which Patrick mentioned, which did at least settle the question of Germany's eastern borders, brought Germany back into the European order, brought it into the League of Nations. And of course, what was missing and what didn't happen, but could have happened, was a Western settlement, or a Locarno for the West. But there were, I think, some very hopeful signs in the 1920s. And I think it's quite possible that without the Great Depression and without the shift towards very radical and extremist politics in a number of countries, including, of course, Germany, things could have turned out differently. I think what we also have to remember, we look back at what happened in Paris, and I think I agree with Patrick. They were dealing with so many things, much of which was outside their power to do anything about. There was a nascent Ukrainian nationalism, perhaps not developed in the way that it's developed in the last decade or so, but there was a feeling among Ukrainians that they were somehow different. But there was no one to protect them. They were in the worst possible part of the world, and the Allies were powerful, but their power was diminishing. Their soldiers and sailors wanted to get home. They did not want to remain in uniform. The French Navy had serious mutinies in the Black Sea. The British had trouble with some of their soldiers who rioted, including Canadian ones who weren't being demobilized. And so I think that the Allies were very conscious that their power to actually affect events was not as great as you might think. There's an assumption always made that people sitting in Paris could have sorted everything out, and they failed to do so. And I think that just doesn't look at what they were dealing with. And the other thing, of course, is, and it happens, the greater the war, the greater the expectations, many of them unrealistic. And I would include among the unrealistic ones the whole notion of self-determination, which actually was a poison gift for the center of Europe, where there were no clear ethnic national boundaries, where the peoples were so mixed up. And even after the new states and successor states were established in the center of Europe, I think a very significant minority, and I think about a quarter of all the people living in those states were national minorities within those states, which was going to cause all sorts of troubles because, the Czechs, who we think of as these wonderful social democratic people, treated their Slovakian minority badly, and the Slovaks resented it. And it also opened the door to irredentism. Hungary made trouble with countries where there were Hungarians. Germany, certainly in the 30s, made trouble in countries where there were significant German minorities, such as Poland and Czechoslovakia. And the problem I've always thought with self-determination, if you determine that you are a nation, when does it stop? There are always subdivisions that can be made. There are always demands that can be brought for an even smaller nation. And this seems to me is both unrealistic and also leads to, do we really want a world in which there are a great many very small nations quarreling with each other? We saw that in the Middle Ages in Europe, and it wasn't a particularly happy world for those who lived in it, except those who are at the top of society. So, I think the other thing Patrick mentioned is this sense of humiliation, and I think we should never underestimate how powerful emotion such as that can be in international affairs. And the German sense of humiliation after 1919 fed in part by the German Foreign Ministry, fed by the German High Command, who were trying to excuse the many mistakes they had made during the war, that they never really lost the war. But it was important. On the other hand, what I always come back to, and I can't explain it, but when you think of how Germany was treated at the end of the Second World War, it was treated much worse. It was occupied, it was divided, it had to pay reparations, its leaders were put on trial. But funnily enough, you don't hear talk in the Germany of today about the terrible humiliation of 1945. And I'm not sure why that is, possibly because the crimes of the Nazi regime were so dreadful and so evident that the Germans could talking about a sense of humiliation perhaps didn't make much sense. But it is, how you end wars is problematic. But sometimes if you end them with total victory, it actually may provide a basis for making peace. I'm not saying I know the answer to this, but ending wars is never easy. And the way they ended the First World War, yes, we can criticize, but what I think we always have to do in history is say, what would we have done? How could we have done it better? And I don't know the answer to that.
That's very interesting. I think there's the idea as well of what historical events are usable and in which ways, and sort of why was World War I usable as a sort of evidence of humiliation, but World War II wasn't. I also always think about how the peace or the settlement that Germany forced on Russia, not quite Russia, on the Soviet Union by that point, and which I think could quite fairly be also viewed as humiliating, and I often think it's one of those that's quite forgotten. But I want to hand over to the audience Q&A. But before I do, I just have a sort of indulgent question for me, given my own research interests, for you, Margaret, about sort of how useful historical analogies are anyway, and also, I suppose, linked to that, what happens when sort of a nation or a group of people become wedded to a certain historical narrative and sort of make it such an integral part of their identity that any kind of differing interpretation is seen as an attack even on the nation itself. How can you get out of that scenario?
Well, on your first part of your question, I think we all use analogies in our lives. We have to. We have situations with a great deal of information coming at us, and we say, well, this looks like such and such, and it helps us to sort through. And nations do that as much, and statesmen do that, as statespeople do that as much as anyone else. I mean, I think analogies are a way of helping our thinking. They can open up our minds to possibilities. We can say, what if we do this? What is likely to happen? Well, let's look back and see a similar situation when a similar course of action was taken. Was it good or was it bad? The danger with analogies is they can become traps. And you will get, for example, the appeasement analogy, which is used far too widely. People saying this is just like the appeasement of the 1930s. Here we are again. You know, that was the argument that Anthony Eden, the British Prime Minister, made over Suez, saying Nasser is just another Mussolini. I dealt with Mussolini. I know what these people are like. And it was the wrong analogy. And so I think analogies are useful, but should be used with care. And you should always entertain the possibility of a different analogy. You know, you've got to keep your mind open and say, maybe there's another way we can look at this. On the use of history, it is, I think, I sometimes think it's increasing, actually. And I wonder if that's because other sources of authority have fallen away. Communism is dead. Very few people, I think, believe in it, except possibly some Western intellectuals. I mean, it's not something that is, no, I don't mean this unkindly, but it is something that is not a mass movement anymore. I don't believe most Chinese, we don't know for sure, but I doubt very much if most Chinese believe in communism, but the Communist Party is there. And so they officially believe in it. And I think religion, organized religion in many parts of the world is not something people have much faith in. I mean, a lot of people don't believe in the existence of a supreme being. So what do we believe in? A lot of people don't trust, you know, politicians, when they do opinion polls, come very far down of trustworthy people. Most elites are not trusted these days. And so I think history has grown in a funny way to fill that gap. And so much I hear now, and Patrick, I don't know what they say in French, but certainly in English you hear being on the right side of history. You know, I want to be on the right side of history, or history will judge, as if history is somehow this impartial judge that we can all go to who will say, yes, you did the right thing, or no, you did the wrong thing. And I think it's acquired more power. And it's used, I think, you know, Putin has committed an act of outright aggression. I mean, it's the sort of war you would have had in the 17th century or the 16th century. He has moved his troops in to seize a piece of land, yet he feels it necessary to provide this, and he may believe it himself, but he provides this argument that Ukraine has always been Russian, the Ukrainian and Russians are one spiritual unity, all this sort of thing. And so I think history has increased power. And I think the power of these narratives, which are often, as we know, very bad history, very one-sided, pick out certain things and don't pick out others to portray. They portray, again, to go back to my point about nationalism, this eternal nation which never changes and will march through time into eternity. And I find it very, very dangerous indeed. And I think part of what we should do as historians is try and fight against it, if anyone will listen to us.
Yes.
Thank you.
If I may jump in just briefly, I do think I very much agree with that verdict, and it's particularly, I think, a response. You know, there's a parallel trend that in many even so-called advanced Western countries, teaching of history is being cut down, simplified, standardized, and that, you know, wreaks havoc precisely where you need to build up something like what I would call historical judgment. Yeah, that of course historians should have, but also in the wider kind of population. If you're a democratic citizen and you want to make mündige Entscheidungen, as Kant would have said, so you want to make judgments on your political future, and you are so susceptible to historical manipulation and leaders or historians or whoever selling you their different ideological versions. This is a real, you know, that's a massive crisis, and we don't have to look to authoritarian regimes that change history books to see how dangerous this is. And I think the Ukraine war shows how many of various stripes historians rather seem to prefer being ideological warriors themselves and do their own way of, as they have done 100 years ago during the Great War, but not helping, but rather obfuscating, or, you know, sort of having one version, or thinking that the only thing you can do is to counter one bad analogy with another powerful bad analogy. And that's exactly the kind of spirit that got us into 1914 and 15, where it's not a fundamental change a thought through response, but sort of going, this is the only game in town and we have to be in it. And I think this corrodes any authority and trust in historians or others having a more, let's say, scholarly or higher grasp of history. And I think that's where there's a clear responsibility, I think, here for historians who call themselves, especially international historians, to provide some standards. I knew this was preaching to the choir, but
thank you. Thank you very much, Patrick. We've got a few questions I'd like to come to sort of from the audience, but they're all quite disparate in a way. So I think I'll just go through them sort of one by one. And I'll start with the first question, which is from an anonymous attendee. He says, thank you for the interesting conversation. Do you think that we are already fighting the Third World War with Russia, or are we just on the brink of World War III? And I imagine maybe this is a reference to, I think it was Fiona Hill's comments recently that we are already fighting the Third World War with Russia. But Fiona Hill is a Russia specialist, but not a historian. So I'll hand over to the historians. Are we in the Third World War, or will you only know in sort of once it's over?
I don't say we shouldn't say, and Fiona Hill shouldn't say what she thinks, but I think it's dangerous. I think we are in a very dangerous situation, and I don't want to make light of it. We have not, I think, world wars involve a great many nations. They involve the application of force. They involve the mobilization of force. I don't think we're seeing that yet, but certainly the groundwork is there. And what I think is very worrying about this moment is the possibility of recklessness or accident. Accident plays a larger role in human history, I think, than we'd sometimes like to think. I don't know what Patrick thinks. I don't think we're yet in a Third World War. I think we're seeing a very dangerous two-state war, state-to-state war, which has the potential to draw in other powers and is drawing them in much more on the Ukrainian side, actually, than on the Russian side. Russia's support is, I can put it mildly, is lukewarm from China and India. I mean, they're not doing much, and they're having to buy, they're having now to buy equipment from North Korea, which I would have thought is a sign of just how few friends they have.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. I would agree. It's a two-state war with global ramifications. I mean, clearly, if we think of, the economic, military, and others, but this is precisely the kind of, I think we're at an age where there's such a kind of superabundance of hyperbole. And people and audiences and social media users are used to always having sort of the next dire crisis. So once we enter, should we, and I hope we will not enter the Third World War, we might not even really notice because it will just be sort of kind of under a cloud of such hyperbole. And I do think it is dangerous. One has to choose one's words carefully. It is one thing to warn of the precise consequences that certain actions or the use of nuclear deterrent sort of language that Putin is operating with has. But this is a far cry from confusing the kinds of measures that, for example, the European Union or the United States have taken and actual belligerency and involvement in the war. And if we blur all these lines, then we are on a slippery slope towards something that we don't want.
Why is this terrifying words? Because it is moment. But your comments, Patrick, about sort of information and hyperbole, I think actually linking quite nicely to David Schneider's question, which asks whether you could comment on, both of you could comment on the speed and scope of the flow of information and its impact on the uncertainty, miscalculations and hubris of the decisions that were made during World War I, presumably given the use of the past tense.
Well, by comparison, it was almost not slow motion, but there was far more, it was a different kind of information flow. And I think one always has to, it's interesting to see, we might imagine that all the belligerents were roughly similar in how they had set up, how they dealt with information, what kind of intelligence capabilities they had, and so on. But these were vastly different political structures, hierarchies with different, for example, realms of experiences. If we think of Britain and its imperial sort of past and everything that had accrued from there, the more sort of authoritarian, but also sometimes Byzantine German machinery, where there was a lot of information, but you couldn't always be sure whether it got to the people who needed it, and the kind of military logic that, of course, assumed that they were the most logical warriors, which it was more self-perception. Russia, clearly, again, a very different animal in that way at the time. And so I think there is, my impression has always been that it's quite striking how, as a rather attuned newspaper reader, if you go through the years of the First World War, you were not at such disadvantage from those who were in the inner circles of decision making, because they did not have very accurate or very privileged information. And for example, intelligence capabilities were minuscule, I would say, compared with what we have grown used to since the era of the Second World War and the Cold War, let alone today with all the technological means at our disposal.
Yeah. I think the technology is so different. I mean, in the First World War, when the German armies were advancing into France, for example, in 1914, General von Moltke, the chief of the German General Staff, was something like 60 miles behind the line. He had almost no idea of what was happening up at the front of the lines. The French had a good domestic telephone system, but they controlled it. Telephone lines are very easy to cut. When he was trying to decide whether or not he'd pull back and regroup his troops, he had to send an emissary, as you would have done in the 18th century. A captain who went round from local headquarters to local headquarters. They didn't have, one of the problems that they found of command in the First World War is they didn't have the technology to do it. The means they had, wireless was very primitive, was very short range. They were using pigeons, carrier pigeons, which they had used before, and they were using runners, people to go behind the lines, who often, of course, got killed, and so did the pigeons. And so, if you want to talk about the fog of war, it really was there in the First World War. And I think I agree with Patrick. What was known about the war was very partial, and the public probably in some ways knew as much as those making the decisions, because there were, in fact, war correspondents. And although the governments tried and the military tried to prevent them reporting from the front, a lot of reports did get through. What has happened, I think, is we see, every war reflects a bit the technology of the time, and we've seen the extraordinary speeding up, which a lot of the military would tell you they don't like. The capacity of government now to issue orders to troops on the battlefield can drive the local commanders, drives them to rage, because quite often those commands are slightly behind time, slightly wrong, don't really understand the realities on the ground. And I think one of the strengths actually of the Ukrainians has been is they've tended to leave their local commanders to take more initiative. But what's been extraordinary, of course, is the use of, among other things, of social media. The ways in which, and again, I think the Ukrainians have used it much more effectively than the Russians, but the ways in which the Ukrainians have used civilians to let them know where the Russian troops are, and the civilians using their phones and taking pictures and sending them, or sending texts back to officers at some distance away, has been absolutely extraordinary. What we've also seen, and you see this in every war, is the importance of propaganda. Again, the technology limits how you do it. In the First World War, they dropped leaflets on each other, and they used print propaganda and used film a bit. Second World War was more film and radio, and the Vietnam War, the television comes in. But what we're seeing now is the impact of social media, both in trying to rally your own people, trying to deceive the enemy, trying to undermine the enemy, and also, of course, which is always important, trying to win over neutrals. And again, I think Ukraine has been the Russians, I don't think, have won anyone over, so to speak. Maybe a few small states who depend on them for money, but Zelensky has been brilliant, and his government have been brilliant at this.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think even the Russians would probably have to agree with that, even if not publicly. Certainly the Ukrainians have done a lot better there. And interesting points as well about the sort of the stories of like old ladies sort of shuffling through and taking photos of different sort of garrisons in occupied territories, sending them off. Yeah. Let me come now to Hans Gilbrod's question. Hans says, thank you for the great discussion. My question, when Foreign Minister Frank Steinmeier invited Christopher Clark to I have very bad German, Auswärtige Amt, to the Foreign Ministry for a discussion of his Sleepwalkers book, looking back, it seemed that German foreign policy acted as if they were in 1913, whereas much of Eastern Europe was thinking it was in 1937. In retrospect, How illuminating was the Sleepwalkers paradigm, and in what ways might it have been misleading? Oof, it's a question.
Well, I mean, look, I think looking back at history is always important. And the Sleepwalkers paradigm, I mean, I probably disagree slightly with Chris Clark on this, who I have great admiration for, but I think there were some deliberate decisions made. There were some who deliberately wanted war. It wasn't just sleepwalking into disasters. There were some people who knew what they thought they knew what they were getting into. Whether they actually knew is a different matter. There were very conscious decisions made. But I think he's right that, you can often find yourself in a situation without meaning to. And then the danger is it becomes too late, or it becomes very difficult to back down. And so I think looking back at what happened in 1913, 1914 can, again, as I said with historical analogies, help us to think about the present and help those who are in the position of making decisions to be careful of what they do, because the consequences are unlikely to be what they hope they will be.
Mm. Yes, I very much agree. I admire Chris Clark's thesis also for its value in terms of being so thought-provoking. But I do think too that we should not underestimate both the decision-making, sort of the emphasis on decision-making and people thinking, that they were taking vital decisions that would win them the war. The sleepwalking aspect I find far more interesting when we think about the consequences, sort of having an imagination for what would accrue out of, what would grow out of these decisions that were made in 1914. But finally, I think the more fundamental lesson I'm trying to draw also in the New Atlantic Order is to look at how did they get into a situation where they were aware that there were many complex challenges, but they had not sort of preempted a kind of situation where they could only sort of react in a quick and sort of reactionary manner. They had not built the kind of mechanisms of consultation, of crisis prevention, all the kinds of things that adherence to the League of Nations or to a new kind of international order had already been pointing to, would point to again during the First World War. So it's always this obsession with the moments, with the final crises that should not prevent us from seeing the bigger picture. And the bigger picture starts, in my view, for example, after the Crimean War, after the unification of Germany, and this escalation of this globalizing, very unlimited competition across the world that was time and time again leading to problems that might really fulminate a war later on. And time it was somehow fixed, but not really. This is the kind of dimension that we need to address also in our relations with Russia after 1989. This does not help immediately now in how to deal with Putin, but we should not imagine that. So why were Western leaders so unprepared in February of this year? This has a lot to do with assumptions, complacency, self-interest, cloaked in lovely sort of ideas that through trade with Russia one could democratize the regime. And then this years after the Crimean annexation. So, I mean, there is no shortage of lessons to be learned, I would say.
I think the danger, if I can just jump in, I think I agree with everything you're saying, but with looking at the outbreak of the First World War, we assume it was bound to happen. And so when we look back to the history of the 19th century, we pick out those things which made it happen. But we could also look at it, and as you said correctly, there was a huge growth in international law, international institutions, a great deal of writing before 1914, which of course became much more salient as the war went on and after the end of the war. But things were being done before 1914 to try and reinforce peace. And there were a lot of people saying we need a new way of thinking, we need a new way of ordering the world. And if peace had been maintained, we'd be looking back and saying that we could see that war was never going to happen because these people were completely right.
Yes.
And benefits of hindsight, or the lack of benefits of hindsight, maybe. Thank you. I'm going to just come on to the last question now, which is from Liana Ekmek-Cioglu. I'm very sorry, Lana, if I've pronounced your name wrong. In terms of legacies of World War I, in terms of the legacies of World War I on World War II, where would you locate the history of genocide? The Ottoman Empire / Turkey not being held accountable, or leading and feeding Hitler's ideologies that led to the Holocaust. Can any sort of links be made there?
Well, Hitler always said, "Who remembers the Armenians?" But I don't think that was what encouraged him to commit genocide. I mean, the origins of the Nazi genocide, I think, lie in the ideas that he and others picked up and absorbed and came to believe as an article of faith. And these were ideas that were floating around Europe and the world actually before 1914. I mean, many of the ideas that Hitler had were an outgrowth of social Darwinism. And a ranking of the races in order of superiority and inferiority. I mean, and the anti-Semitism, which had marked so much of European life. Curiously enough, not in Germany so much more in Russia, or indeed in France. But nevertheless, the fact that the Ottomans or the Turks got away with the Armenian massacres, I think, may have been something that encouraged Hitler and his colleagues to think, well, we can get away with it too. But that's not why they did it. They would have done it whatever, because it was, to my view, a core element of what it was to be a Nazi. I don't think it was. I don't agree with those who say that Hitler was, in his own way, just a German nationalist trying to make Germany dominant. I think the racial element, the extermination of the Jews, the superiority of the Aryan race was integral to everything he did.
Yes, no, I very much agree on both points. I mean, both for the German and the, let's say, the Hitlerian German sort of extermination policies. Armenia is more peripheral, but I think this wider scope that Margaret mentioned is also instructive insofar as it shows that within wider societies, if we look at pre-1914, the German Empire, there was also forms of anti-Semitism, social and civilizational Darwinism, but there wasn't, without the ruptures of the First World War, the Great Depression, the kinds of anti-Semitism that came out of the defeat and the unacknowledged defeat, and trying to find people to blame, the capitalists, the Jewish capitalists, the American Jewish conspiracies, and so on. We do not get to the kind of critical mass that then caused this still, to my mind, unique civilizational rupture of not just some Nazis or few of Hitler's cohort, but thousands upon thousands of German desk and other perpetrators committing this horrendous crime, and so we need the era of the two world wars and all that happened in between to understand how this was possible. And in this sphere, I think it's good to have a more global view and make comparisons and look at Armenia, Turkish attitudes towards race and hierarchies in their own settlement. But I think I'm not an expert here. But if you look at the wider history of the Ottoman Empire, you could also write a history of the relative tolerance and relative. I would not do that, but one could not have a kind of history of inevitability leading up to the Armenian massacre either.
No, I mean, it was a very deliberate policy. And it was fostered by the government from the center, and they made use of existing tensions between the Kurds and the Armenians and encouraged. But, I've always thought Mark Mazauer's book, The Dark Continent, is very good at reminding us that a number of these ideas are not particular to any particular country. They cross borders, but how they then take root and what becomes of them, of course, depends on particular circumstances. And I think, without the First World War, I remember reading somewhere that the chief rabbi in Germany before or just after the war was concerned that the Jewish community might disappear because there was so much intermarriage.
Yes.
And, the most anti-Semitic of all the European powers, I think, was clearly Russia. But France, with the Dreyfus affair, there was a strong streak of anti-Semitism in France. But as Mazauer points out, there were anti-Semitic streaks in many other countries. The United States, the great democracy.
Yep, absolutely. Nothing very comforting there.
No. To be honest, there hasn't been a particularly comforting discussion, and yet so it makes me feel either that I'm slightly odd, or maybe it's psychologically telling that I found it such an interesting discussion, one of the most interesting discussions I've had in a really long time. And I'd like to thank you both, Patrick and Margaret, for such intellectually stimulating, if incredibly depressing, sort of insights, and for sharing your considerable expertise and talking about your wonderful books with us. I've enjoyed it with all of the caveats that I've made about the depressing.
Thank you.
Thank you for leading through it. It was a great
thank
pleasure.
You very much. And a pleasure to be in a discussion with you, Patrick. Thank you.
Same here. It was a great pleasure.
Thank you to the audience as well for your questions and for engaging. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you.